Well, I'm sure that the comment section will be filled with tons of polite conversation for this story. What's popping, players? Welcome to another edition of Breaking Badger News. I am your host, as always, your friendly neighborhood Simpsons kin, Max Derrett. And joining me for this particular edition of this series is the Doge in charge, Brian Martinez. Brian, how you doing today?
I am good. Currently, I am a Puerto Rican hairless, which is another breed of Doge. That's what happens.
What? What's the difference between being Puerto Rican hairless and just regular hairless?
Well, no, so there are these Chihuahuas are often called Mexican hairless dogs, even though they're not really hairless. But there are some breeds that are, and so Puerto Rican, because I'm not Mexican, so Puerto Rican hairless, or maybe we'd call it a shipwrecked Mexican hairless. How about that? Yeah,
sure.
So I'm currently bald, is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. When it comes to like dogs and stuff like that, I don't know because I've never investigated the different breeds of animals because I'm literally allergic to everything. But besides the point, let's talk about a different type of animal, one that tends to be a pest to many people, the fly. And we're going to be talking about the Lord of the... I don't do transitions. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a remake of a very famous story called Lord of the Flies. It was originally written by William Golding way back in the day. I don't know how long ago it was, but it's one of the greatest novels of all time. And there have been two movie adaptations of this particular novel, one in 1963 by Peter Brook, and another in 1989 by Harry Hook, the former being much better, but the second one not being that bad. They're both enjoyable on certain levels. However, today, well, a few hours ago, a report came out of Deadline that Scott McGehee and David Siegel, who are famous for directing movies like What Maisie Knew and The Deep End, are writing and directing a new version of Lord of the Flies. Now, the film will supposedly stay faithful to the book, but with one major twist. The cast will be all girls rather than all boys. In respect to this particular detail, McGehee said they were taking the opportunity to tell it in a way it hasn't been told before, with girls rather than boys, which shifts things in a way that might help people see the story anew. Now, social media reaction can be surmised like the following. 1, an all-female remake would quote-unquote miss the point. 2, women wouldn't act like that. And 3, the writers are 2 men. And some tweets in respect to these particular topics are as follows. Roxanne Gay tweets on the subject, an all-women remake of Lord of the Flies makes no sense because the plot of that book wouldn't happen with all women. Froy Next Door tweets, Lord of the Flies is about the replication of systemic masculine toxicity. Every 9th grader knows this. You can read about it on SparkNotes. Rachel Leishman tweets, the female-led Lord of the Flies wouldn't ever happen because women would just branch off into their own respective groups peacefully. Bullshit. Whoa. And Aisling Toomey tweets, 2 men are remaking Lord of the Flies with girls, proving that they didn't understand it when they read it, which is hilarious. So, Brian, you're familiar, well, I mean, you've read Lord of the Flies like we all did back in high school. I just wanted to ask, in terms of, what do you think about the concept of another Lord of the Flies movie, as well as the concept of doing it with all women, and the valid nature of some of these comments? Like, what are your general thoughts?
Okay. Well, a few things going through my head now. So, one is let's just take a step out of this particular story and just say that I would actually really like to see film adaptations of classic literary works like Lord of the Flies, assuming they were going to try to do it as faithfully to the source material as possible. Because, when we have done adaptations, a lot of the time there are things added on, changes that are made, and so on. And I wouldn't actually be averse to a Lord of the Flies remake. I think it's a really great book. I think there's a lot of things that you can read into it that, for me, are... Well, we can get into what Lord of the Flies is about, but I would love to have seen it. But I don't think that this is the way to go. And maybe it's because I don't think that the culture of Hollywood is in a position where it wants to make true to form adaptations. It wants to make, I think, these sorts of, here's an adaptation of something with a twist, and it's always some kind of progressive add-on, like changing the cast to women or something like that. And historically, it doesn't actually serve the product. Now, what I mean is, it doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically going to be bad just because they change things like race or gender or sexuality, or they modernize the context. Like, do you remember? I didn't see it because I didn't want to, but do you remember when they did a remake of Romeo and Juliet, but they said it in modern times and they put, like, guns in it instead of swords? Like, some people, do you remember that?
No, I can't.
Oh, that was with Leonardo DiCaprio and...
Wait, that was the one? With
Kate
her
Winslet?
and Claire Danes?
Oh, yeah, Claire Danes, that's right. Is the DiCaprio, Claire Danes, and that Puerto Rican guy. And, so that was Romeo and Juliet. And they even did the film with all of the same language, the word for word, like in terms of the lines as Shakespeare wrote them, but they put it in a modern context. And for me, that was just like weird and off-putting, although I'm sure that there are people, maybe products of the time, that may have liked it. I mean, there was some soundtrack songs that I thought were all right.
Love me.
Yeah, that's the one. That is the song. But
Brian's favorite song of all time. Go on.
It is one of my favorite songs. I actually like that song. But because there's a 60s sound to it. But anyway, so getting back to Lord of the Flies, I would say that when it comes to in my personal feelings on it, if you're going to do a film adaptation of a literary work, and you can look at the way it's been done in the past in those two other previous adaptations, and you think you can either do a more faithful and more importantly, a version of it that will actually hit the core sort of, talking points of the core spirit of what the book is trying to say, while being, really honoring the source material, I think that I would personally absolutely love that. And I'd like to see that in more stuff. But I don't think Hollywood is culturally in the right place to do it, because I think they seem to be focused on this progressivist idea, which I think gets in the way of their ability to do the stuff that I'm hoping for. Now, speaking to the social media reaction, I'm going to look at what these individual tweets say. So Roxanne Gray said, "All women remake of Lord of the Flies makes no sense because the plot of the book wouldn't happen with all women." I think that there's some truth to that, actually, because men and women are different, and I think that the way that girls would deal with this would be different. I'm not saying that they wouldn't do well. I think that it would be like Mean Girls, I think, is basically how it would turn. They would split off into cliques, and they'd probably not talk to each other. And it's like, I'll give you a good example. There was a show, it was like a Survivor style show. And they did a special series of episodes where they had a male team and a female team. And they had to survive with nothing, okay? And the men cooperated. Now, of course, these are adults, so this sort of changes things a little bit. But the men cooperated pretty well, and they built shelters, and they started hunting food and everything else. The girls couldn't get anything done. They actually ended up getting into cliques and infighting and stuff like that, and they couldn't accomplish the goal of survival. It got to the point where some of the girls were trying to get into the guys' camps. And I believe they even may have used their sexuality to do it, which is actually kind of and this is just the way things happened. There were this is not a reenactment. This is not a dramatization. This is the way it played out when they were put in this sort of reality TV survival situation. So what really would happen in a situation where girls, by the way, the boys in the story were between the ages of 6 years old and 11. I think the oldest was 11, maybe 12, maybe. And that is something that's also important to consider, because girls between the ages of 6 and 11, their survival skills are going to be a lot less than an adult woman, obviously, right? So I think it would significantly change the story, and it would also likely miss the point. So that's I would say that. Now, I don't know if you wanted to add anything onto that. I don't want to just talk over the whole thing.
Okay.
So.
Well, here, I'm actually going to shock you and everybody. While I would normally agree with your perspective on, in terms of Hollywood and just the way they tend to put a spin on these classic tales, I think this is a brilliant idea. I think this is bloody brilliant, and here's why. So, we've already had a couple of Lord of the Flies movies. The first one is pretty damn faithful to the original material and is a pretty damn good movie. And then we had a second one in 1989, which was pretty good, just not as good. And so if we're going to do the story again, what would be an interesting way of retelling that story without sort of just doing a modernized retelling of that old 1963 movie, or just taking that plot and copying and pasting it? Well, it sort of dovetails into what you're saying about how women would handle a situation like that compared to a man. And I think instead of the more straightforward descent into the primitive side of human nature that boys have, I think if you're going to have all girls, you can do something really psychologically interesting with that, because Lord of the Flies is very psychological in terms of its descriptive material in the book as well as the movies. And if we can bring something like that, we can actually get something that's a lot more sinister and violent and different. So I think on that basis alone, along with the fact that, you got Scott McGeehee and David Siegel with the movies that they've directed, they've generally been very well received. And just one other thing, in respect to the response that people have been making about women being a whole lot more peaceful than guys, I don't think that would be the case. I think what would happen, if they're going to be adapting Lord of the Flies, what would happen is you would have the same basic story beats. They'd come across the pig head, one of the main, well, actually I won't go beyond that just because in case other people haven't read the story, I won't spoil anything. But there would be the same basic story beats, but that descent into that savagery. Yes, yeah, exactly.
So it's tribalism specifically that they descend into.
Exactly. I think the process, if done right, can be something really, really fascinating. So I am actually going to choose to be very excited about this.
No, you know what? Actually, I don't entirely disagree with you. I was going to get to that. There are some things that I think could be really interesting. The thing is, though, I don't think it, because if you change the way that it goes, I mean, it'll be the same story beats, but the behavior and reactions, if you are going to treat the girls as though they are girls and not simply boys with girls' bodies, like if you tell the exact same story but you just change the gender, then people are not they're gonna sense that something is wrong, because the way girls would react in this situation would be different, and you could still hit the same story points, and I think it could still be good, but then it's not Lord of the Flies. It might as well just be called something else, but you could still tell that story. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just don't think it's Lord of the Flies anymore. Now, the other thing is that I'm okay with them doing it, because the only way you could make this film, or a film that tells a story like this, you would have to explore the dark side of female nature. I actually would be open to seeing more of it, because the thing is, I wouldn't go so far as to say that just because they replace the cast, it necessarily makes this film feminist. Because if it was feminist, then all the girls would, in fact, get along, be strong, work together. It'd be like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, and by the end, everyone got home, they built their own boat because they don't need any man, and everybody lives and everything is fine. Unless, of course, like one man went with them and there was actually a boy among them and he ruins everything. That would be a feminist version. But if they're going to do the actual, like if they basically wanted to hit the same, crux of what happens in Lord of the Flies in order, and like descend into the same kind of tribalism, which would basically be like, cliquishism or whatever, then you could do that with girls and you could explore the dark side of femininity, which I would be more than open to seeing. I think it would be good, but I don't think it would be Lord of the Flies anymore.
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean. It's sort of like World War Z, where the movie didn't really happen to be anything about the original book. It was just, they took the title and then they made their own story. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from with that. I guess what they'll have to do naturally is just have to manipulate the source material. But anyways, just as long as it makes for a good movie at the end of the day, that's all that matters to me. I mean, do what you need to do. And just one other thing, in respect to, the people that are really upset about the fact that two men are going to be writing the script and directing the movie, and thinking that will compromise sort of the trying to bring out the femininity of the characters and explore that female dark side. Brian, did you like Wonder Woman?
Yes, I did. And as I understand it, a filthy, filthy penis wielder is the person who wrote that film as well.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, look, I understand, like, maybe it's good to have some female consultants. So, like, oh, maybe, the girl wouldn't act like that. A little girl wouldn't act like that in that particular circumstance. Maybe, like, psychologists, if you really want to go in depth with this source material, do something like that. But it's not a deal breaker if you're going to be telling a story filled with all girls and think that that's going to compromise it. Plus, one of my favorite films of all time, The Descent, features an all-female cast and was directed by a man, Neil Marshall. And you definitely feel the feminine essence of power just emanating from those characters, and it's done so damn well.
Yeah,
it's also one of the greatest horror movies of all time. Go ahead.
Don't forget that some of a feminist favorite female characters and TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Xena Warrior Princess were also created by men, Joss Whedon and Sam Raimi. So yeah, I mean this is being made by men, therefore it's invalid comment is just kind of worthless, especially if you look at the kinds of stuff that feminists tend to praise. It's usually man-made stuff. They just happen to be the men that are okay. And also, one other thing, what is Lord of the Flies about? I think that there is definitely an element that explores a toxic masculinity, whether it's valid or not. But I think it's more about when you don't have civilization. It's like what happens when you try to build a civilization and then tribalism takes over because of the we're talking about children here that want to do whatever they want, and they divide up into camps. One person that wants to essentially use reason, and I don't want to spoil anything, but there's one side of it that's all about reason and organization and rules and law and civilization and order, and the other side of it that's about strength and tribalism and survival and competition and stuff. And these are all masculine traits. So it's basically the upside and the downside. It's cooperation and it's competition that's taken to extreme levels. But I think that it's more about it's sort of like The Walking Dead, like The Walking Dead TV show, at least, because that's what I know. I didn't read the comics. But if you watched it, I only got to season 6 or something, but if you watch it, you see the group, is what they call themselves, they try and they run into other groups that have their own way of governing each other. So sometimes they're democratic, sometimes they're dictatorships, sometimes they're anarchists, and it sort of works out. There's even, some examples of a socialist, model, I think, under the guy with the eye patch. But anyway, you see like these different ways of governing humans in this sort of post-apocalyptic world, and that is what they're exploring ultimately in that television show. And I think that Lord of the Flies does the same thing. It just uses children to explore art, because children tend to be more sort of lizard brain, id oriented in terms of their behavior, and so you see how they cope with these circumstances. And it's a really powerful read. If you've never read it, I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. Yeah, thanks so much for that thought out and eloquent explanation, Brian. Normally when I just try to explain Lord of the Flies to somebody, I just say it's Apocalypse Now, but for kids. But anyways.
Which it is.
Yeah, which it is. But it's just, it's not as...
It's Heart of Darkness all over again.
Exactly, but just for children. Anyways, this is, I think it's a brilliant idea. Brian's a lot more skeptical. I'm sure a lot of people have some interesting opinions on this. We would love to hear you guys put down in the comment section below. I'll say
this. I am cautiously optimistic. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say. Like, I think it could be good. I just don't think it needed to be called Lord of the Flies. I think it's sort of like piggybacking on the title to get people interested, but it could have just been anything with the same premise. And I think if they really explore it honestly, if they really go into it with, going into the female psyche, if that's how they want to approach it, I'd like to see that. I actually think it will actually trigger more feminists than not. But I would like to see that.
Absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this particular edition of Breaking Badger. Like I said, I'm sure that you all have a lot of thoughts that you want to share on this particular topic. Make sure to leave them in the comment section below. We'll make sure to update you on the more news regarding this movie as it comes out. Before you go, though, please make sure that you like this video because it really helps us out. And if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. Honey Badger Radio puts out tons of videos every single week, including Breaking Badger. I want to thank Brian for doing this episode with me on such short notice. And until next time, please have a lovely, lovely day.